The hum of the plane's engines was steady, almost soothing, as the passengers settled into their seats. It was a packed flight from New York to San Francisco, one of the busiest routes in the country. People were talking, browsing through magazines, fiddling with their phones, and preparing for the long flight. Among them were families returning from vacations, businessmen heading to conferences, and a few students on their way home. Nobody expected this to be an ordinary flight, but not for the reasons you might think. As the last few passengers made their way down the narrow aisle, a tall man in a black hoodie and jeans quietly walked through the cabin. He looked like any other traveler, with a slight air of focus about him. His face was partially obscured by sunglasses, but there was something striking about his presence. He wasn't dressed in the typical first-class attire, nor did he appear to be a businessman or a celebrity. He paused at row 15, and the cabin attendant smiled politely. "Sir, can I help you?" she asked, looking up at the boarding pass in her hand. Without saying much, the man nodded and pointed to the seat in the middle of the row. The attendant looked puzzled for a second but then confirmed, "Oh, you're in 15D. She gestured for him to take his seat. And that's when it happened. As the man sat down, the entire cabin froze. Elon Musk had just boarded the flight, only he wasn't seated in the luxurious first class. He wasn't traveling in the exclusive comfort of a private jet, which he could easily afford. No, the billionaire and CEO of SpaceX and Tesla, the man who had revolutionized space travel, electric cars, and so much more, was sitting in economy class. The reactions from the other passengers were swift and immediate. It didn't take long for whispers to start circulating. Is that Elon Musk?" one passenger asked, trying to keep their voice low but failing miserably. "Definitely looks like him. But why is he sitting here?" another replied, glancing toward Musk's seat with disbelief. Musk settled into his seat with a calm, almost meditative demeanor, as if the buzz around him didn't bother him in the slightest. He didn't make eye contact with anyone, his attention focused on the window, his fingers gently tapping against the armrest. Meanwhile, the passengers in the surrounding seats were busy trying to process what they had just seen. It was one of those moments where reality collided with disbelief. How could someone like Elon Musk, a man with billions of dollars at his disposal, be sitting among them in the cramped, uncomfortable economy section? It was as if the universe had decided to drop a subtle message that wealth, fame, and power didn't have to always create barriers between people. Or maybe it was just Musk's own way of sending a statement that he was not above the everyday experiences that the rest of us face. But while Musk's calmness seemed natural to him, the passengers around him couldn't help but feel a mixture of awe, confusion, and curiosity. Some of them started nudging each other, pointing discreetly, and taking surreptitious photos. Others, too polite to stare, tried to pretend they hadn't noticed the world-famous tech mogul sitting right next to them. One particularly bold man, a middle-aged business traveler in a blue suit, couldn't contain himself any longer. He leaned over to Musk's seat and said with a nervous chuckle, "Excuse me, sir, I don't mean to bother you, but I think you're Elon Musk, aren't you?" Musk turned his head slowly, his lips curling into a faint smile. "Yes, I am. Sorry to disappoint you," he said in a tone that was both humble and slightly amused. "Just another day in the life of an ordinary guy." The business traveler blinked a few times, still unsure whether this was a prank or not. You're really sitting here in economy? I've seen your jets, your private yachts. You're a billionaire. Why not sit in first class?" Musk shrugged. "Sometimes it's good to mix things up. I like to keep a perspective on things. Plus, I wanted to experience the flight just like everyone else. See how the regular folks live?" The man stared at Musk for a few more seconds, utterly baffled. He'd heard about Musk's eccentricities, his unusual decision-making, but nothing prepared him for this. He wasn't sure if he was in the presence of an iconoclast, a genius, or just a very rich man who felt like making a statement. The cabin was growing quieter now. More people had started to notice Musk. Some were gathering the courage to approach him, while others were too intimidated or uncertain to say anything. But the question on everyone's mind was the same: why was Musk sitting in economy? Was this a stunt? A social experiment? Or was he really just the down-to-earth? For now, no one could say for sure. As the flight began to taxi down the runway, the overhead announcements droned on, signaling the typical flight safety briefing. But inside the cabin, the real story was unfolding. The presence of Elon Musk had sparked a chain reaction, and passengers were no longer able to ignore the fact that a celebrity was seated just a few rows away from them in the mundane world of economy class. The atmosphere was electric with whispers. Some passengers tried to keep their cool, pretending nothing was out of the ordinary. Others couldn't resist the temptation to glance back at Musk, who sat there, quietly adjusting his seatbelt with a peaceful expression on his face. At the back of the plane, a young woman with dark curly hair and a camera hanging around her neck had her eyes locked on Musk. She was a freelance photographer traveling to San Francisco for a photo shoot, and her instincts told her this was a rare opportunity. She slowly made her way up the aisle, trying not to draw attention to herself. When she reached Musk's row, she hesitated for a moment, unsure if it was appropriate to approach him. She took a deep breath, mustered up the courage, and tapped him lightly on the shoulder. Musk turned to face her, giving her a brief smile before she spoke. "Hi, I hope I'm not disturbing you. I just wanted to say I'm a huge fan of your work. You've inspired so many of us to think differently about technology and the future. If you don't mind, would you mind if I took a quick photo?" Musk regarded her for a moment, then nodded. "Sure, why not?" he said, his voice calm and collected. She raised her camera and snapped a quick shot. The flash illuminated his face for a split second, but Musk didn't flinch. Instead, he seemed almost amused, as if he'd grown used to this kind of attention. She thanked him quietly and walked away, feeling both grateful and a little overwhelmed. Back in the front of the cabin, the flight attendants were struggling to maintain their professionalism. They had been trained to handle all sorts of situations, but having one of the world's richest men sitting in the back of the plane with the common folk was something they hadn't been prepared for. "I can't believe this," whispered one of the flight attendants to her colleague. "Is he really sitting in economy? Why not first class? He could buy the whole plane if he wanted to." Her colleague shook her head in disbelief. "Maybe he just wants to blend in. I've heard he does weird stuff like this all the time. The guy doesn't seem to care about the usual celebrity perks." As the plane climbed higher into the sky, the chatter continued. Some passengers tried to engage Musk in conversation, while others simply marveled at the sight of him sitting in such an ordinary seat. It was as if a ripple of curiosity had spread through the entire cabin. One man, who appeared to be in his late 30s, turned to the person sitting next to him, shaking his head. "I'm telling you, this is the craziest thing I've ever seen. Elon Musk sitting in economy class? This is like seeing a superhero just hanging out at a bar." The person sitting next to him, an older woman with a warm smile, chuckled. "Well, maybe he's just a regular guy after all. The man does change the world, but that doesn't mean he's too good for an ordinary flight. Maybe he's just trying to remind us that we're all human." The man raised an eyebrow. "But why here? Why now?" "It feels like a statement." "It's probably his way of telling the world that success doesn't need to be flashy," the older woman responded. "You don't need to flaunt your wealth or status all the time. Sometimes the most powerful people are the ones who remain humble." Her words seemed to resonate with the people around her. Several passengers nodded thoughtfully, as if trying to piece together the significance of Musk's choice to sit in economy. Was he making a statement about the excesses of wealth? Was this his way of breaking free from the usual expectations placed upon billionaires? Meanwhile, Musk sat silently, oblivious to the growing number of conversations being sparked by his decision. He hadn't said much to anyone, but his actions were speaking louder than words. It was clear that something deeper was at play here, something beyond just the fact that he was flying in coach. As the plane continued its journey across the country, an air of contemplation settled over the passengers. For many of them, the flight had transformed from a simple, routine trip into something far more thought-provoking. They were sharing a space with one of the most influential figures in modern history, and yet they were all bound by the same small seats and cramped aisles. Was this Musk's attempt to connect with the everyday person? Or was it something more? No one knew for sure, but it was becoming clear that this flight would be remembered for a long time. The plane cruised above the clouds as the hours ticked by, and Musk remained seated in his economy class seat, seemingly unfazed by the constant stream of curiosity around him. Passengers continued to glance his way, some too shy to approach, others daring enough to engage him in conversation. For the most part, Musk didn't seem to mind. He simply sat there, calm and unassuming, as if it were just another flight. However, as the flight progressed, something unexpected began to happen. It wasn't just the occasional glance or whispered conversation that filled the air, it was the way people started to open up to him, drawn in by the peculiar nature of his presence. Musk was, in many ways, a paradox. A man who had changed the world with his technological innovations and vision, yet here he was, sitting among everyday people, striking up casual conversations. A middle-aged man in a gray suit who had been watching Musk for some time finally decided to act on his curiosity. With a hesitant smile, he turned to Musk and asked, "I hope you don't mind me asking, but I've always been fascinated by your work. How do you manage to keep such a level head with everything that's going on in your companies? I mean, between SpaceX, Tesla, and everything else, it must be overwhelming." Musk didn't hesitate, meeting the man's eyes with a thoughtful gaze. It's all about focus. You can't do everything at once, but you can do a lot if you prioritize. My goal has always been to push the boundaries of what's possible. But I also believe in balance. It's important to stay grounded no matter how high you fly. The man nodded slowly, clearly impressed by Musk's response. That's an interesting perspective. I think most people, including myself, often get bogged down by the pressure to succeed. But hearing you say that makes it sound a little more manageable. Musk smiled gently. It's all about perspective. The pressure is there, but it doesn't have to control you. Take it one step at a time and don't be afraid to make mistakes along the way. That's how you learn and grow. The conversation shifted from business to personal matters as the man asked Musk about his interests outside of work. Surprisingly, Musk didn't shy away from discussing his hobbies, from reading to playing video games. He spoke of his love for adventure, the way he found solace in simple activities like hiking or riding his electric bike. It was a stark contrast to the image of him as a tech mogul constantly in the spotlight. Here, in the confines of an economy seat, Musk was just a man sharing his thoughts with a fellow traveler. Meanwhile, in the aisle behind them, the young photographer from earlier had been eavesdropping on the conversation. She was still processing the surreal nature of the moment. It wasn't just that she had photographed Elon Musk, she was now hearing him speak about life in a way that felt entirely human. It was easy to view someone like Musk as larger than life, almost untouchable. But here, on this plane, she realized that he was, in fact, just another person trying to make sense of the world in his own way. Curiosity bubbled inside her. This wasn't the Elon Musk she had expected to meet. She'd thought he'd be aloof, perhaps even unapproachable. But this man, sitting right beside her, was thoughtful, reflective, and open. She had to know more. She couldn't resist any longer. With a quiet, nervous breath, she stood up and made her way over to Musk once again. "Hi, Mr. Musk," she began, her voice wavering slightly. "I'm sorry to bother you again, but I've been listening to your conversation, and it's really been eye-opening. I've always admired you from afar. But hearing you speak so candidly makes me feel like I'm seeing a side of you that I didn't expect. Could I ask, what motivates you to keep pushing forward? With everything you've already achieved, what's next?" Musk looked up at her, his expression thoughtful. After a brief pause, he replied, "I think for me it's always been about doing something that lasts. It's not about getting to the top. It's about creating something that changes the world for the better. The next step isn't about my success. It's about the bigger picture, about humanity. We're at a point where we need to think beyond our planet, beyond our current understanding of what's possible. The future is what drives me." The young woman stood there, captivated by his words. It wasn't just the visionary aspect of his answer. It was the way he spoke so passionately about the future of humanity. It was as though Musk had found a deeper purpose in his work, one that wasn't just driven by profit or recognition but by a desire to leave a meaningful legacy. "I think you've just given me some perspective on my own work," she said, almost to herself. "I've always been caught up in the hustle, but maybe it's time to think about what I really want to contribute to the world." Musk's smile grew a little wider. "Exactly. It's all about contribution. You don't have to have all the answers right away. Just start somewhere and let your work reflect your values. It's a marathon, not a sprint." The conversation between the two was short but impactful. The young photographer returned to her seat, her mind buzzing with new ideas. It was as if the chance encounter with Musk had opened a door to a new way of thinking, not just about her career, but about life itself. Meanwhile, the other passengers continued to observe from their seats, still processing the surreal nature of having Elon Musk on their flight. Some were chatting about the conversation they had overheard, others were reflecting on their own thoughts, and a few passengers were even taking the opportunity to approach him for a quick word of encouragement or admiration. But one thing was clear, Musk had unwittingly turned an ordinary flight into something extraordinary. His mere presence had changed the dynamic of the plane. It wasn't just about his fame or wealth, it was about the sense of connection he had sparked in the people around him. The cabin was buzzing with conversations. For the most part, the passengers had settled into a sense of calm and even camaraderie. People who never would have spoken to one another before now found themselves exchanging ideas, reflecting on the brief yet insightful moments they had shared with the man who was responsible for changing the landscape of modern technology. It was as if they had all been part of something bigger, something extraordinary. But just as the plane had settled into the rhythm of the flight, an unexpected interruption threw the calm into chaos. Suddenly, a loud, frantic shout pierced the air. A woman sitting several rows behind Musk began to scream, clutching her chest. Her face turned pale as she gasped for air, struggling to breathe. The flight attendants rushed over immediately, but it was clear that something was wrong. The woman's breathing was labored and her pulse was weak. A medical emergency. Is there a doctor on board? The lead flight attendant called out, her voice tight with urgency. For a moment, it seemed as though no one moved. The panic in the cabin was palpable. The woman's cries echoed through the air, adding a layer of tension to the already charged atmosphere. The passengers in the rows around her shifted uncomfortably in their seats, unsure of what to do. And then, from the back of the plane, a calm and steady voice cut through the noise. "I'm a doctor. Let me help." The voice came from none other than Elon Musk. He had already stood up from his seat, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to the chaos unfolding around him. As he moved quickly to the back of the plane, the other passengers couldn't help but stare. There was no hesitation in his steps. He moved with purpose, his face serious as he navigated the aisles toward the woman who was now struggling to breathe. The flight attendants were already at her side, but the presence of Musk seemed to reassure them. He knelt down next to the woman and began assessing her condition, asking her questions as he examined her. It quickly became clear that she was experiencing a severe allergic reaction, her throat swelling rapidly. It was a life-threatening situation and time was of the essence. "Do you have an EpiPen?" Musk asked calmly, his hands already searching the woman's bag for the device. The woman's eyes widened in panic. I don't know. I didn't bring it with me." Musk's face tightened with concentration. "Stay with me. We need to act fast. Does anyone here have an EpiPen?" There was a moment of tense silence, followed by a frantic rummaging through bags by the nearby passengers. Finally, a man in his late 40s, a father traveling with his wife and child, spoke up. "I have one," he said, his voice shaking slightly. Without missing a beat, Musk took the EpiPen from the man, inserted the needle, and injected it into the woman's thigh. The action was swift and precise. A few tense seconds passed, and slowly, the woman's breathing began to improve. The color returned to her face, and the sharpness of her labored breaths softened. "Easy, just breathe slowly," Musk instructed, his voice still steady and reassuring. The woman's eyes fluttered open as she regained her strength, her panic slowly fading. She looked up at Musk, still dazed but now able to breathe freely. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice trembling. I don't know what happened. I'm so scared." Musk gave her a gentle smile, his voice calm. "It's okay. You're safe now. Just take it easy." The flight attendants quickly moved in, ensuring that the woman was stabilized and comfortable. The captain made an announcement to the passengers, reassuring everyone that the situation had been handled and there was no immediate danger. But even after the emergency had passed, the atmosphere in the cabin had shifted. The passengers were no longer just in awe of Musk's decision to sit in economy class. They were witnessing firsthand his ability to act decisively and effectively in a crisis. This wasn't just a man who changed the world through technology. This was a man who could take charge and lead in the most unexpected of situations. As the tension in the cabin dissipated, passengers exchanged looks, some nodding in quiet acknowledgement of what had just transpired. The young photographer who had been watching the scene unfold couldn't help but feel moved. She had witnessed firsthand the quiet leadership that Musk had displayed, and it was a side of him she hadn't expected. It wasn't just about being a genius inventor or an influential CEO, it was about stepping up when it truly mattered. Even the flight attendants, who had been in a state of high alert, now seemed to relax, grateful for Musk's quick thinking. The rest of the passengers, too, appeared to breathe easier, their earlier curiosity about the billionaire's choice of seat now overshadowed by a shared sense of respect. Musk returned to his seat quietly as if nothing extraordinary had happened. The woman who had been in distress was now resting comfortably, surrounded by a small group of concerned passengers offering her support. The rest of the flight proceeded without incident, but the experience had left an indelible mark on everyone. For some, it was a reminder of the unpredictability of life and the importance of remaining calm in the face of uncertainty. For others, it was an example of how leadership could come from unexpected places, even from a man sitting in the back of an airplane in economy class. As the plane continued its journey through the skies, the passengers seemed to settle into a new rhythm. The buzz of excitement from earlier had shifted into a more reflective tone. Conversations around the cabin had slowed down and there was a quiet understanding among the travelers. The woman who had been in distress earlier had now recovered completely, and her calm was a testament to the decisive action that Elon Musk had taken in her time of need. The young photographer, who had been inspired by Musk's words and actions, could hardly believe how much her perspective had shifted in just a few short hours. From the moment she had recognized him as the famous CEO of Tesla and SpaceX, she had viewed him as a larger-than-life figure. But now, after witnessing his calm under pressure, his willingness to engage with strangers, and his genuine humility, she saw him differently. He wasn't just a tech mogul, he was a man who had found balance between ambition and humanity. She had taken some time to reflect on their brief conversation, feeling as though she had gained new insight into not just her work, but her approach to life. Musk had spoken of creating something meaningful, not for personal gain, but for the benefit of others, something that would last long after she was gone. For the first time in a while, she felt inspired, not by fame, but by the thought of making a true difference. Back in his seat, Musk seemed to return to his quiet contemplation. He was surrounded by people now, but not in the way most would expect. There were no reporters, no adoring fans. There were simply passengers who had come to appreciate him not for his wealth, but for his character and ability to lead by example. The flight attendants, still reeling from the crisis they had just witnessed, couldn't stop talking about the way Musk had handled the situation. They had been trained for emergencies, of course, but having someone with his poise take charge had made all the difference. It wasn't just about his medical knowledge. It was about his ability to remain calm when everyone else was losing their composure. As the flight neared its destination, the captain made a final announcement. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be beginning our descent shortly. We've had an unexpected, but very important, lesson in humanity today. On behalf of the crew, I'd like to thank you for your cooperation during the medical emergency. We're about to land safely, and we hope your experience with us today has been a memorable one." There was a brief moment of silence, followed by soft applause. The passengers had been through something unique, something few people ever experience in their lives. They had not only witnessed a man who was capable of extraordinary achievements, but also a man who could step into a crisis and handle it with grace and precision. They had witnessed the quiet strength of a leader who, despite his global recognition, was not above the smallest acts of humanity. As the plane touched down and began taxiing toward the gate, the passengers slowly began to gather their belongings, ready to disembark. But something was different now. There was a sense of unity in the air, a shared moment that connected them all. They were just people sitting on a plane, bound for different destinations, but for a brief, fleeting moment, they had shared something truly extraordinary. Musk stood up and began to make his way to the exit. As he passed through the cabin, many of the passengers who had been sitting near him exchanged nods or murmured words of appreciation. Some even reached out to thank him once more for his quick thinking. Musk simply nodded in acknowledgement, offering a brief smile in return. It was clear he wasn't looking for recognition. He had done what anyone else might have done in his place. But for the passengers who had experienced this day, it was clear that they had just witnessed something that few would ever forget. The young photographer, now standing by the exit, waited for her turn to leave. As she walked past Musk, she couldn't resist saying one final thing. "Thank you, Mr. Musk," she said softly, "for everything you've shared today. I think we all learned something from you." Musk turned to her, offering a small but genuine smile. "I'm glad to hear that. Just remember, the world is full of opportunities, and sometimes they come in the most unexpected ways. Don't be afraid to take a different path." And with that, he walked off the plane, disappearing into the terminal, leaving behind a cabin full of people who would forever remember that extraordinary flight. For the passengers, it wasn't just about the billionaire who had chosen to sit in economy class. It was about the leader who had been there when they needed him the most, the man who had reminded them of the power of staying grounded, of making meaningful contributions, and of acting with humility and compassion in the face of unexpected challenges. As the young photographer made her way out of the plane, she looked around at the other passengers, many of whom were still talking in hushed tones about the events that had transpired. She felt a deep sense of gratitude for the experience and for the way it had changed her outlook on life. It wasn't just the fame or fortune that made Elon Musk remarkable, it was his humanity, his ability to lead by example, and his willingness to step outside the box. And as she stepped into the terminal, she promised herself that she would carry these lessons forward in her own life, striving to create a legacy of meaning and impact, just like the man who had sat beside her on that flight.